All right. Well, hello.
Hello. How smart are you feeling today?
I'm feeling about as smart as usual, which isn't too smart, but I
85% smart?
85% smart. And it's up to other people's judgment, so
Yeah. Well, how about sassy? How sassy are you feeling today?
probably about as sassy as usual too. I feel a little bit more confident. I just recently finished my thesis for school, so that's my undergraduate thesis. I'm really waiting on hearing back from my advisor now, and then it'll be put into the academic library there.
What's the thesis on?
So the thesis, if I can actually pull it up, I can give you the title, but it was on the usage of the internet or internet usage in protest movements. And it's a comparative analysis between uh, the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement and Black Lives Matter here.
Which was more effective?
Uh,
For whom?
Black Lives Matter ended up being more successful, I think, but probably not in the ways or as originally intended, particularly by all of the protesters. And the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests have completely been squashed. Really, they're not. There's probably not much going on in that regard. So it's kind
So,
of unfortunate.
yeah, thinking through that, we can see that the powers that be in Hong Kong are decidedly different, at least on the surface, than the powers that be in the United States of America. But we know that I would assume maybe you could change my mind and make me a little less black-pilled about this, that the powers that be allow that those protests which work in their favor. And
Um,
I don't know if BLM necessarily on a wide scale was good for the powers that be,
I
whereas
think Black
the
Lives Matter was great for the powers that be. Well, one thing that I really went into looking at or focused on in my thesis was how welcoming the corporate sector was to the grassroots movement. So in Hong Kong, you didn't really see too much of an embrace by the corporate sector, and if anything, you kind of saw a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of influence. So a perfect example would be even American celebrities like LeBron James would be a great example, who were effectively contracted by Chinese corporate groups to kind of do what they can to admonish the protesters and to reduce the international presence of the protesters. While in Black Lives Matter, you saw the protest movement get warmly embraced by everyone in the corporate sector. Now we have new diversity and inclusion training programs and whatnot that were, really spurred on by the movement. And you also really saw an embrace in sort of like highbrow industries, like, say, for example, fashion or something like that, where there's a ton of money.
but you don't see AOC showing up to prom with a Save Hong Kong dress on.
Oh yeah, she would never do that. There's too much corporate interest against an independent Hong Kong at this point. So it's pretty interesting the reason why um, the Hong Kong protests never picked up.
So, in your estimation, the reason why the Hong Kong protest never was never picked up is because of corporate interests.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
a big thing is just money. You know, if the movement and its activists are able to gain sort of like both extreme financial backing, corporate protection, and just generally like sort of commercial interest, then they'll do well. And then protest movements that have all its corporate cards against it, they do quite poorly. And I think especially because at least when it comes to Chinese industry is just a major influence on all of this. So even if they were Western sympathizers to the protest movement, notable ones too, they weren't really able to kind of engage with the protest at the same level as you saw like some celebrities in like the United States. So I remember I was in New York during the height of the protests for Black Lives Matter, and it was during that whole rioting phase where people were running around and like destroying like Soho and all of that, Lower Manhattan. They were going into Brooklyn and going into the Bronx and the Queens and just kind of destroying things. And you saw a lot of celebrities promote this, and a lot of like really notable celebrities as well.
The
So
vice president, well, she wasn't the vice president yet, but she was running as the vice president, was advertising, fundraisers to bail people out of jail for participating in those.
yeah, I remember one in particular that kind of like really pissed me off or bothered me was do you know who Chrissy Teigen is? She's like
No.
a relatively well known she's a pretty famous I would say supermodel who is married to John Legend and is notable on Twitter for being one of the like she's known as like kind of like a liberal girl boss on Twitter, if that makes sense. Like she does all of the campaigning. I'm campaigning for like Act Blue and those sorts of organizations. She's a hardcore Democrat. And I remember during the protest, she was like offering bail relief. So, she was posting tweets and Instagram stories like, oh, if you go protest like, on behalf of Black Lives Matter and get arrested, I'll pay your bail, blah, 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 all of these things. And I couldn't help but feel like it's just very ivory tower, like, hey, kids who have actual like things to lose, go out on the streets and risk your lives for me, a rich person that can pay to get you off, sort of taking none of the actual sort of risk.
I have friends who are in college. I suppose you're my friend, so you're one of them.
Yeah.
And the response to the pandemic has come down on college students. It seems like more than anybody else. And the amount of tests, I have a friend that goes to the University of Chicago or one of the affiliated colleges or universities. And, the COVID protocols and getting tested all the time and college switching on and off, on and off and on and off. So you have a generation that's being put through this constantly moving Byzantine labyrinth of bureaucracy and completely shepherded constantly and controlled and probably incentivized to obey or else lose out on the rewards that the system offers. So they are at once the most pliant or perhaps even pliable generation in America. And when it suits the ruling class for them to go out and to destroy minority-owned businesses for the sake of minorities, they're not punished. They're not even, it's not even that they're not even punished. They are rewarded. I know that colleges, before the pandemic and at the beginning of the pandemic, they would just have these demonstrations after demonstrations, and the administration would just allow that to happen and basically give them credit for protesting and give this generation, you fought the man, good job. Here's your official stamp of approval for fighting the man. But at the same time, when it comes to a disease that statistically has negligible effect on their lives and their health, statistically speaking, they are completely controlled. It just seems like your generation is, and we spoke about this before, is going to have to figure out their own values and kind of cut through the amount of manipulation that's coming at them. Yeah, go fight the man, but follow these guidelines. It's so totalitarian and yet, useful idiot cannon fodder. That's one perspective. I might be overstating the case. What's your thought on
I think a big thing is that a lot of people my age feel almost like their youth has been kind of neutered or stunted, especially by the pandemic, because early on, like the level of fear mongering that they kind of pushed on us, like I can totally see how it's derailed so many lives, and there's not really, when you've already derailed your life so much, your early or like your early 20s and your late teens that you've spent indoors, like you're going to probably be more compliant than ever just to live normally, you know? I feel not just sorry. I shouldn't be sort of self-pitying or anything like that, but I certainly feel jealous of people that kind of went to school and graduated in the years before me, before the pandemic and everything, because they really, probably got the most out of that short period of their life. And I think you have a lot of people trying to like kind of grasp some sort of, glory in their youth still. So, whether that is attaching themselves to kind of like a major protest movement or something like that, that might not necessarily be as transgressive as they think or believe. It's just something to get them out there. I think that's what spurred on a bulk of the protests in New York in 2020 was because like we had shut down the economy, shut down schools in the March of that year. So by the summer, like, I know my friends, like they were itching to get out. I had a bunch of friends that participated in the I wouldn't say riots, but the demonstrations. So,
Do they feel fulfilled by that? What's the chatter on in your friend group about protesting and about the lockdowns and about changing the world, or do they just want to get through it? Are they addicted to their cell phones and just completely just accepting a virtual life? Or
it really depends on who you talk to. So for me, and if you were to talk to my personal friend group, because we were all in the political science department, and we were all already talking about these things like years before it became sort of like normal or became like a popular thing amongst people our age. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has always been like a popular movement since the 2016 election or so. But at least in terms of like contextualizing in the broader political world, that's something that political science students get that's demanded of them by their program. And you're starting to see a lot of people start to really question whether or not Black Lives Matter and that sort of those sorts of organizations and stuff like that, whether or not they actually have the interests of the public in mind. So I'd say some of my friends who are more disconnected from, that sort of like broad political thought. So people who might not be interested in doing this at all for a career or anything like that, they're kind of, I wouldn't call them sedated or anything like that, but, they're pleased with how things are going and they're just sort of going through the motions of like, saying Black Lives Matter, supporting like what they see as like pro-Black businesses and stuff like that. And then when you talk to people who are in positions where they question this as a potential career, they're getting really disillusioned. I've noticed that. I think you're starting to see a lot more radicalism from people about my age, from people who would otherwise be seen as too old to have radical beliefs as well.
in which direction? Radical in which direction? Anti-statist or pro, I guess, far left?
I would say, so from the people I can think of, there are people moving further and further left. So you're starting to see a lot of people who identify as like Marxists and not necessarily like the sort of progressive Marxists that, have become sort of like critiqued by right-wing media. They would probably lean more conservative Marxist and stuff like that. And you also see people who are becoming anti-statist, people who really are starting to doubt whether or not the central government has our interests in mind at all. And you're starting to see a lot of people start to kind of like proliferate like sort of populistic politics.
In what way?
Populism would be, extreme concern for the ordinary man and a sort of disillusionment with the elite.
Okay.
You don't see people with the same aspirations as before because a lot of people, they don't really want to be kind of like bureaucratic robots so much. And I don't think that they feel like they're being productive. I know one thing that went really viral. There was one TikTok that went viral that I remember seeing, and it was by a girl around my age. I don't know who she is, but it was basically her saying like, we've been protesting Black Lives Matter for what seems to be a year and a half, 2 years at this point, and I haven't seen any of the money in the hood. And I think that's true. Like, I live in Philadelphia right now, and I can just walk around North Philadelphia and see that none of these Black people are being helped by these politics. So, it's like, where's that money going?
Well, it's going into the people who raised the money.
Yeah, it's going into the bureaucracy. It's probably paying off some random, like, bureaucratic agent that might not even be Black. So,
Yeah.
so it's really unfortunate. Yeah.
Well, it there might be a silver lining to it insofar as intersectional politic is inherently, from my point of view, unstable and infinitely gameable by basically the ultimate rule at the end of that game. The progressive stack is to the victim go the spoils. And we know that the victim, all you have to do is win victim status in order to get whatever you want. And watching that in action and watching pouring one's idealism into a system that then outputs no change and probably the opposite of what you wanted in certain respects might be the chance for those who would have identified as woke or were involved in cancel culture and were very, even just honest, to put it simply or stupidly, very mean to people with different political views, people who are more conservative, are now saying, this other way wasn't working. Maybe.
I wonder if you probably start to see a lot more people my age warm up to kind of like right wing or conservative politics. And I think a big reason is that a lot of it probably has to do with age. I think obviously the older you get, the more conservative you become. And I would say, looking at my political views from like when I was 16 to now, that's like a 6-year time span of change. Yeah, I definitely can see myself having rapidly become more conservative. I don't think I would say I'd become less radical, but I'd probably have become more conservative in my concept of the world and how change can happen. So,
what do you mean by radical and what do you mean by conservative then?
By radical, I just mean I'd like to see drastic change, as though, society as it stands now probably can't continue on without some kind of radical change. But at the same time, I would characterize conservative as sort of like American conservatism versus American progressivism, as like sort of the opposite. I've become less and less progressive. I don't tend to support sort of diversity and inclusion programs anymore as much as I used to. Before, I thought it was a good thing I thought diversity and equity programs were good when I was younger. And now I'm not so sure anymore because I don't believe in intersectionality in the same way.
So from your point of view, having been just having grown up during this time where diversity, equity, and inclusion was pretty much, I mean, it's getting stronger, but it's top down. Your organizations that you have to deal with going forward are going to have these trainings and going to have this morality embedded in all these different systems. And you are saying that that's not necessarily, you thought it was good. You don't think it's so good. What about it is not good from your point of view? And how would your argument be framed in such a way that people of your cohort would be more amenable to being a little bit more skeptical about that morality?
I mean, the biggest thing would probably be like growing sympathy to viewing the world in terms of class. So, as I got into college and I got to meet more people, I started to realize that like just because someone ticked off the sort of intersectional like victimhood boxes didn't mean that they were sort of materially dispossessed. And that was like really shocking to me. I didn't grow up very wealthy at all. And, I wouldn't call myself materially dispossessed, but I was low income, qualified for like Medicare and stuff like that as a child. So, when I got to school and I got kind of lumped into sort of like that, like, I guess like diverse groups of people, and I realized they all came from the same income bracket, that was really like, that definitely disillusioned me a bit. Because I mean, like the common thing you hear now is sort of especially when you listen to like sort of Fox News and like a lot more, I guess like nativist leaning kind of rhetoric. like say, for example, Tucker Carlson or something like that, they sort of talk about how white, our white counterparts are, being materially harmed by some of this like rhetoric, the sort of diversity and inclusion. Because like when you look at the poverty rate, obviously minorities are disproportionately represented, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any poor white kids either. And it's sort of insane to me or absurd to me that, there are upper middle class Black kids, upper middle class, Hispanic kids and stuff like that, kids raised in good homes, raised in wealthy environments and stuff like that, who have ample access to whatever sort of, opportunities they're interested in. It's insane to me that they can claim more victimhood than a low income white student. That was something that like money really does make the world go around. Like, and the older you get, the more you realize how important that money is.
So with that, I guess thinking in terms of class and thinking in terms of material reality, how does that form into a conservative? How do you approach those conservatively from your point of view?
I don't see progressive changes needing to happen on any like basis of like identity anymore. So I guess my conservatism, by conservatism, I don't think I would lean particularly like conservative. It's just that the status quo now is very progressive. And I don't really see identity politics as something that needs to be progressed on, if that makes sense. There's nothing to improve on that front in my eyes.
Mm-hmm. So how would change, from your point of view, where would change need to start to happen?
I think a big thing would reducing sort of the biggest thing would probably be really rethinking where or in what government expenditure is used on. So the biggest thing would be infrastructure projects, infrastructure. That matters way more. Infrastructure in lower income areas, infrastructure outside urban centers, that sort of thing matters way more than ever before. And like obviously there are barriers to accomplishing those goals, both material and like immaterial. So for example, when it comes to like legislative policy, that takes a while to sort of be pushed through. And then there are like actual material reasons why, like say for example, like a national like railway system can't be completed. That's fine. Yeah.
And so with your thesis done, what's your plan next? Are you going to get even more politically scientific?
I think ideally, yes, because it's something that I found. I found that that's where my talent lies, in writing and sort of communications like that. I have my Substack blog that I started back up again after a hiatus, and I realized I had like maybe like a couple hundred followers on there, and I was surprised to even see that so many people were interested in what I had to say about anything. So, if people think that I have pretty astute sort of like observations and a knack for critical analysis, like I'm happy to keep doing that sort of work.
So what's something that you want to do next? What's your next thesis or series?
My next thesis? The next piece I'm going to start writing, I've been planning it, but I haven't started quite yet just because I'm in the early stages of gathering information for it. I like to do my research well. Is really, it has to do with the pandemic response, the public health response to COVID. I had just finished the Ivan Illich book, Medical Nemesis, that kind of talks about sort of the both iatrogenesis, so the sort of pathologization, sorry about that, of normal human experience and the sort of like excess like bureaucratization of the medical sector and whatnot. I'd really like, reading, I read that book over Christmas break, and I was just very shocked that I was shocked that it had been written in the 70s. And it just feels like the problems laid out had gotten worse and worse and worse each decade, to the point where we're in now, I guess, where you have like this sort of extreme top down control over society during a pandemic that effectively is not really a big deal for the vast majority of people. You know, there's so many problems with a pandemic response, it's unreal.
Yeah, I mean, I have somebody who works in the in the state, and deals on the ground with the response, and sees things differently than I see them. Sees a lot of the sick, and sees a lot of the need, and sees a lot of the disparity within the different communities to getting access to what people call a vaccine, and have to kind of redefine what vaccine means to include the mRNA things in that.
Mm-hmm.
But, just for sake of brevity, we call it a vaccine. And my friend is thinks that the government should come down harder, should have been a lot quicker, and that's not going to happen. The government's this lumbering beast, and we kind of want it to be slow. But the problem is that when it starts to fall or going in the wrong direction, to correct that direction takes so much more resources and takes a lot of time, because there's so many vested interests and so much red tape going down. And then I work for a school system, so we see that the CDC says one thing, and then and then Washington State says something else, and the county says something else, and we have to reconfigure our guidelines while we're losing teachers. I mean, our budget's just running dry because we have all these subs now. Because if somebody gets positive, they're out for 2 weeks. And there's no way that this can go on. We cannot actually materially go on for that. And you see the Democratic leadership kind of either realizing that too late, or when it's politically expedient for them to then change the response, right? But the problem is there's so many different layers of it. The problem is that they were evoking science to shut down any conversation that went against their guidance, and kick everybody off the internet that went against their guidance, went against the narrative. And now they're saying that same narrative for that people who got kicked off were saying. It's just, there's so many different levels of this.
I agree quite strongly with the take that the government should have went harder at the beginning of the pandemic. And I mean this particularly at the at the onset of it, because a major thing is that at least, there's a section of my thesis actually deals with the pandemic response and how that affected these protests. And when looking at the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, you saw that, they had already been shutting things down in China, or in the south of China, in January. And we didn't think to do anything until March. All of the alarm bells were ringing, and, you had the American state, and not necessarily the American state, but probably more like sort of like the journalist sector. You had them sort of saying a lot of this information was withheld by the CCP and blah, 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 blah. But even then, we were months late to getting any organized response. And, from what I've read, it seems like, especially with these pandemics, is the earlier you nip in the bud, the better. But we're already 2 years in, so I don't know if sort of draconian policy really helps anyone at this point.
Well, that was the fear, I guess. And then also the entire apparatus would have had to switch gears to lockdown. And we don't want a government that could be able to do that. But now we have a government that has done that. But it took a while to convince the public to go along with that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just, I guess it's a deficiency of insofar as we are a democracy, and there are so many different vested interests that are all pitted against each other, that to get everybody mobilized takes a while. And then once we are mobilized, then it's really difficult to change the narrative. It's really difficult. So now everybody's going to have to get sick. All the people who are vaxxed and boosted are going to have to get sick and say, oh, that wasn't so bad. Why did I end my life for that? And why did these vaccines, didn't protect me. I guess I didn't die, but everybody's going to have to now realize and kind of wake up to this kind of this narrative that's been, this fear mongering and all this stuff. And it's going to have to happen on an individual by individual basis. And then there has to be incentives for the ruling party to release us from the restrictions in order for it to happen. And I don't know about your state, but I think Washington kind of basically wants to be Canada, it feels like, which is the exact opposite of what I want to be. I want to be in go towards the Florida thing, but
it's really shocking when you look at like sort of the numbers. And I remember early on in New York, looking at sort of like, they had like that website where you could track everyone who died in New York City from COVID. And it was a horrible website in the sense that like there's so many people that had died. But if I have to be critical, and I feel like this is completely cruel to say, when you would scroll through and you would see photos from this obituary, you could obviously see that these people had more than like two comorbidities, And it was like, well, I wonder why there was such a lax response on like improving public health just generally, so that way people could combat the virus. You had people who were, very obese. And I don't mean this in like an anti-body positivity way or something where, whether you're beautiful or not doesn't really matter. It's whether or not you'll survive a pandemic, right? But you had a lot of people who were very overweight, and everything in culture really seems to be encouraging sort of weight gain. People gained weight over the pandemic as well with the lockdowns because gyms were closed. People are ordering in food. People are too afraid to go to grocery stores as well, which is like another unfortunate aspect of fear mongering. People really get scared to live their normal lives, even just going on walks. So it's terrible. Like they lined up a lot of people for death for no reason, and then a lot of the other people who were passing away were above the age of 65. And a lot of people who passed away were people that had pre-existing diseases or illnesses like cancer, something like that. And the most frustrating frustrating narrative is that we needed to protect the elderly. And this isn't to say that like, I don't agree with protecting the elderly at all. It's just more whether or not the quality of life is even good at that rate. Because you had like, you have sort of elderly people who have been completely sequestered into like nursing homes and stuff like that, haven't probably been out in 2 years because they're just too afraid. And it's like, well, how many more years do you even have left that you're spending your remaining ones in like a sort of prison state? It's just sort of insane. I know someone in my personal life, not super closely, just an acquaintance, that this person, is in their 60s, and they disinvited their mother, so their mother being in her 90s, from like a Christmas celebration this year because of fear of the Omicron variant. And it's like, how many more Christmases does your mom have? Shutting her out from one of the last few Christmases she might have because you're afraid she might get sick and die. Like that's not pragmatic in the slightest. This response has been, it's the government response, the government rhetoric, and then the public's reaction to that have just been completely disastrous, I think.
I volunteer for a spiritual organization, and we put everything on pause for a year, and we're trying to get back up and running. But because of our age sector, it's mostly people, because it hasn't flourished, or for a variety of reasons, it's mostly boomers who are in charge and who are the main donors and who are the main participants. And, we were trying to take polling to see if we can have another gathering, and the responses were really split. What do you guys want from a gathering? A lot of people were like, no restrictions. Everybody should, this is not about this or that thing. Everybody should be free to do whatever they need. And then a lot of people were like, we should have testing every morning for everybody. They should have their cards coming in. We should have this and that and this and that, all these protocols. And it's just like, what do you do with the population that wants to behave that way? And they're behaving in their own self-interest, which isn't bad. I'm not calling them selfish, but our organization is going to die because they don't want to, or they don't want to, go on with life. And there's plenty of people. It has completely arrested the organization. And I don't know, it's going to have to, it's going to have to come from the top down to say, actually, this isn't as dangerous. It's not as dangerous anymore. It's not as dangerous. And that messaging has to be incentivized. It has to be like CNN and the Democratic Party and all that whole cohort that are like have the reins and the control over the liberal elderly or boomers. The liberal boomers are completely enthralled by their narrative. They're going to have to change their fear mongering to do some brave mongering or courage mongering, and that will only happen if it fits in their interests to do so. Either that or there's got to be a revolt of some sort.
Yeah.
Or a resistance, even passively.
I mean, I think that they're starting to really break people down. 2 years in, there's some people who have been kind of, really following the messaging since day one that are starting to get frustrated, and maybe it'll be their reaction that drives change or something like that. But I know the people who have been sort of skeptical of, the whole narrative in the first place from the onset of the pandemic, they're definitely, I think, breaking down a lot more, So, I mean, one major thing with the pandemic that's really been like kind of concerning me is like sort of the rhetoric about the unvaccinated versus the vaccinated. And, the sort of like, you have medical professionals basically admitting that they have no sympathy for people who are unvaccinated, who get sick and are hospitalized. And they don't seem to intuitively understand how shocking that comes off to basically everyone else, who's whether or not, their frustrations are sort of valid or not. And the reason why I kind of find it so shocking is it has to go back to an infrastructure problem. When I was reading about sort of the business sides of things in terms of the medical industry, like the actual like financing and like sort of like structural development of the medical sector over the past 2 years, like I found that like 40 to 50 hospitals went bankrupt this year alone, or I mean like 2021 alone. And it's, like they have like this sort of narrative that like it's unvaccinated filling up the ICUs, they're shutting everything down, blah, blah, blah. ICU capacity at like an average hospital is probably like 30 people at most. And then on top of that, hospitals have been going bankrupt or running at a complete loss for the past like 2 years,
Why? Because they're geared only to focus on this one disease and not treat every other disease that...
I think part of it, honestly, and it has way more to do with this. It has more to do with the fact that the health sector has a lot of financial problems at like even prior to the pandemic starting, especially because a lot of these places are kind of sort of running for profit, if that makes sense. Like, you have nonprofit hospitals and they're relying on government subsidies and sort of like private subsidy and stuff like that. And then those are just the large hospitals that are able to receive any funding and produce research and whatnot, gain grants. Smaller hospitals are the ones that are shutting down. Yeah.
When we go back to the protest conversation, and there was this terrible thing that happened, the worst thing that's happened since the Civil War, where for 2 hours a bunch of Trump supporters beat up a couple cops and stormed the Capitol building. It's the most terrible thing to ever happen to our country. And because of that, or in response to that, the people in charge have spent the most money of any, I think of any investigation to bring all those people to justice and to put them into prison and to really very slowly prosecute them or treat them as the enemies of the state that they apparently are. And then on top of that, you have Joe Biden, the president of the United States currently, has wanted, they're starting to set up these anti-domestic terrorist organizations and putting infrastructure in place to make sure to preserve America from domestic terrorists who are apparently this big threat. If it turns out the case that this is actually a political maneuver, that the Democrats are actually making a mountain out of something that was stupid and wrong, but they're turning it into a 9/11 and then using that to suppress their political opponents, What's your take on the math of that, of a pro-democracy movement happening in America in response to political persecution by the Democrats against, or the so-called, probably more neoliberals than the progressives, suppressing the conservative and the underclasses who fit into the conservative mold?
I think I tend to err to the side of thinking they are making a mountain out of a molehill, in terms of the Capitol riot. And that's a really controversial take, I think, to have, especially in like neoliberal and progressive spaces, because like when you talk to any liberal, any like, good liberal, they they see sort of like it as like this unprecedented, like horrific kind of event that is draws like is a threat to democracy in the same way 9/11 was in some respects or something like that, like just completely like blowing it out of proportion. But for the vast majority of Americans, they're wholly unaffected by it. It was something that we saw on our phones or on TV or something like that. And I think that the average American, they don't really care. I remember seeing there was like some recent Quinnipiac poll or something that said that like 40 something percent of people surveyed like sort of didn't care about they didn't really care about the sort of Capitol insurrection or anything like that, whatever you'd want to call it. And I kind of agree with them. For a lot of conservatives especially, they're getting particularly frustrated because the Black Lives Matter protests materially caused more issue, for the average American. You had people's entire livelihoods destroyed over the course of like a few months, because like the Black Lives Matter riots went on for a few months, and I'd love to call them protests, but they weren't always protests. There were some peaceful like gatherings for sure. A lot of it was, you had like a lot of sorry, you had a lot of, yeah, it was a squeak toy for my dog.
Oh, okay.
Just apologize for
I
that.
thought you were stomping on a baby for a moment there.
No. Yeah, you had a lot of people like basically not care about the Black Lives Matter protests in this, or not care about the Capitol insurrection in the slightest, because the Black Lives Matter protests had been so severe. What does it matter to, say, a random American living in like the Bronx that like the Capitol was invaded? They probably don't have no reason to go there or be in DC for any real reason. So, they're probably more concerned that their neighborhood was up in flames. Or, why would anyone in LA or anything like that care about what was going on to like congressional figures in DC? So I think a lot of people are starting to get really like sort of frustrated with like that sort of rhetoric. The only people that seem to care are like the good liberals who kind of see this as like a sort of transgression on democracy, when in my eyes, it kind of is like democracy at its peak. People are actually frustrated with how things have been managed and how things have been going on. A lot of it might have been spurred on by frustration with the pandemic. A lot of it came from like literal distrust in our electoral process. If you distrust the electoral process, what else is there to do but go to the Capitol? Whether or not they're right or wrong, I think there's a lot of like sort of opportunistic like manipulation going on by like a lot of like more corrupt like Republican politicians that kind of falsely incentivize this sort of behavior amongst their constituency. I also think like that sort of QAnon thing too really was not great, but it was like obviously sort of like a manipulative like conspiracy theory organized by, I watched the HBO documentary and it appears it was organized by some sexpat in like the Philippines or something like that, to promote a website, it seems. So, you had a lot of people led astray, but at the end of the day, those people were normal people, ordinary people who thought what they were doing was standing up to an elite class that sort of upended the electoral process or trust in the electoral process. So I can't really fault them for it. So treating them like they're villains, I don't know about that.
Do you think that there's a middle ground for the people who aren't allowed to speak with each other because they're siloed in these two different worldviews or these two different narratives that are going on? Let's say the frustrated social justice warrior and the frustrated MAGA cap wearing,
Mm-hmm.
gun toting, average guy that just wants to run his tile shop in
Yeah.
Nebraska. Is there a way for a third medium or media or narrative to combine those two, you think? Are there any cracks?
I
Is there a
think
crossover?
a really strong center populist movement would be good. I think not right leaning populist or left leaning populist, but center populist. One that doesn't really kind of sort of one that doesn't sort of hinge itself on stroking like the worst aspects of each side. So,
Hmm.
you really need an organization that is concerned with equity, social equity, but isn't necessarily concerned with identity politics. Something like that, where you have like sort of like this sort of fractionalized. I mean, with intersectionality comes a fractionalization, and each and every single person has to be characterized by every aspect of their identity. Yet a populist movement that sort of abandoned that and focused more on sort of class and equity, I think you would see a lot of people, finding common ground. I think both you know, like a low income, like hyper progressive person, hyper woke person could probably find middle ground with like some conservative, like sort of rural, anti woke persons if they both agreed that they dislike the same people, which would be probably like a neoliberal elite.
Well, the problem with the neoliberal elite, if you look at their representatives, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala
Mm-hmm.
Harris, is that it's so difficult, so damn difficult to dislike them. They're such likable people that,
I I wouldn't say I'm surprised, honestly. I find it surprising people really like them. I mean, I'm aware that people my age, like, they have done what they can to try to appeal. I know they had like Olivia Rodrigo, or like she's like that, like a new pop star or something like that. They had her meet with like Anthony Fauci and like the Biden administration and do like photo shoots in the White House, appeal to people my age. But it also feels like a lot of people are really seeing through it. Maybe more people will start to see through it. So,
on the other hand, if we, I would like your take on Bernie Sanders and AOC. Do you think that they're, well, do you think that they're showing a way, another way for the left to go, or what's your analysis of that? And especially just how you see your generation reacting to their politic and then their presentation.
um, give me 1 second to think. That's a broad question. I'd say with I tend to lean more sympathetic to Bernie Sanders than I ever did AOC. And a lot of it has to do with like sort of like career span. So over the course of his entire career, Bernie Sanders has maintained pretty consistent in his ideals and projected beliefs. And with AOC, it didn't really seem to take long for her to fold. But yeah, you saw AOC really fold on her sort of like I guess projected belief system. So a perfect example would be the whole Iron Dome vote that happened recently. Um, and by recently happened a few months ago, where you had like the sort of like that progressive squad, like the DSA squad or whatever, be campaigning harshly against Israel and like pro-Israeli politics, and yet at the end of the day, because she was running for her Senate seat, she abstained in her vote against like the funding of the Iron Dome, and that was just really a sign that like as much as like as popular as she is with like the sort of left like DSA like progressive groups, at the end of the day, she's a politician and she has to maintain like sort of popularity with her constituency. She wants to, be at all notable and or maintain her career, which is fair. Not really my place to judge, but it certainly does mean sort of negative things for like I guess like real progressive change for her. And then the Met Gala thing that happened, where she was wearing that dress that had "Eat the Rich" plastered on the ass, and the Met Gala itself, like she said that the woman who designed the dress was like this sort of immigrant, like minority immigrant woman who checked off all these intersectionality boxes, but she was actually like some like millionaire designer from Toronto, which isn't really like an immigrant. I don't
And
know if
then
that
she
really.
she she was way behind on her taxes too. She hadn't paid her
Yeah.
taxes in forever.
Yeah, that was another. Yeah. And I think with AOC, I'm not sure. I know people my age, like she has like a really strong cult following amongst people my age, but I think more and more people are starting to kind of realize that a lot of it's posturing on her end. Like it's a lot of posturing. Maybe as she gains like more and more sort of structural power, you'll see her, start to put her, start to, I mean,
Be more
do what she
consistent.
says. Yeah,
Yeah,
be
yeah.
more consistent. But I don't know if we really can trust her or really believe in her broadly. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of her like sort of posturing either. I don't agree with the sort of DSA both worldview, and I don't really agree with their solutions. But in terms of just seeing like actual material change, I was a bit hopeful, even if I didn't necessarily agree with their methods. But I'm not really sure if that's a possibility anymore.
Do you
So
see, when you look out on the political level, do you see anybody from a centrist or a center right point of view that can capture the imagination and the backing of your generation? Or what would be the qualities you think that the youths are looking for?
I mean, in terms of politicians that I quite like, um, I have some hope for Ron DeSantis. Um, and a governor of Florida potentially might run for the RNC nomination if Trump doesn't really run. Uh, I really wish he would detach himself from like the Trump presidency, just that like from a strategic perspective, it might gain him votes on the end of like the sort of existing like pro-Trump like boomer class. But I really think Ron DeSantis and his like rhetoric has the capacity to appeal to like sort of the ordinary American and like the ordinary like Gen Z like new voting age like crowd for
Hmm.
sure. And the
Hmm.
reason being is because he's to the point. He speaks in a very to the point manner, and he's very pragmatic in his sort of politics, and we've seen that in his method of like governance in Florida. And they're doing what they can to smear him, but and I believed a lot of the smears at first, but then I really sat down and listened to sort of like the speeches he would give and like sort of like the town halls he'd do, and I don't really think he's doing anything that isn't in the interest of like his constituency beyond maybe like excess sort of like self advertisement to like a group of people that he might not really benefit from advertising to. So like the really pro Trump sector of like the
Mm.
voter bloc. If he
Hmm.
stopped doing that, I think he'd be real popular.
Do
Uh,
you think that there will be a rise of the normies? Back in my college years, there was this movement called straight edge, where a lot of people were like, "We're not going to drink, we're not going to do drugs, but we're not necessarily conservative. We're just self-controlled," and it was kind of like just this kind of aesthetic. Is there going to be a rise of the normies, you think, in your generation? Because, libs of TikTok, there's a lot of accounts. There's this, TikTok culture. There's the gender thing. There was the Black Lives Matter thing. We'll see when that pops back up again. But there's a lot of, Antifa. There's a lot of radicalism. There's a lot of weirdness. It doesn't seem like you guys will ever turn out normal or okay because you guys got your cell phones, and, there's a lot of gnashing of teeth about your generation. But there's got to be a lot of normies there that just aren't speaking up or not making waves, because that's not what normies do. But do you think that they're going to be faced by a choice to actually, say, there's values in America that we want to maintain and bring forward, and the current regime isn't doing that, and so we need to kind of wrest the narrative away from the crazies in order to get things done?
um, I think there are a lot of normies. I think a lot of normies tend to fall into like the sort of average neoliberal, like doesn't really like likes Joe Biden, thinks Joe Biden is like a better choice than Trump, sort of like likes Hillary Clinton, doesn't really see an issue with her career history, like those sorts of people. I think that will become like sort of like the normie like stance in like Gen Z politics, unfortunately. So that's like really going to hinder real change. In terms of straight edge movements, I feel like um, sort of general drinking and drug use might have gone up amongst people my age during the pandemic, at least because they were all like shut indoors. But I can't really speak for everyone. It's just that, when I think of like sort of political spaces that are popular amongst Gen Z, a lot of them do glorify using drugs. A lot of them sort of like glorify mental illness. They really glorify, um, sorts of things that would probably be in complete opposition to like the straight edge movement of like the late 80s, early 90s, I think. So, yeah, I try to think right now, like there are like popular political podcasts amongst people my age, like like the Chapo Trap House, which was like really popular with like people who supported Bernie Sanders in like 2016, and you saw a lot of people connected to that podcast get big. So they were like, I don't know, I'm trying to think. There's like one podcast I can think of that got really popular who is run like that was run by a former like campaign manager for like the Sanders campaign or something like that. I think it's run by Brianna Joy Gray, but I can't remember what it was called. Those are like the ones that are like getting really popular right now, and I guess they would be considered more normal to like. Um, and I don't know if they're saying anything too radical, and they tend to support like the current prevailing order, which is not necessarily bad. They tend to lean more progressive in the sort of like things that they want to see done, but they still support, you know, the Biden administration and like the general Democratic Party. They would never lean right. There's no way they'd ever flip Republican. Then you have, the Red Scare podcast that's been gaining a lot of traction recently because they had like I think they had Alex Jones on. They've had like Steve Bannon on. Um, they have like basically a lot of like major like right wing figures come onto their podcast, and they used to actually be like Bernie Sanders sort of like supporters. So, and
Do you
they
think that that's
are.
opportunism at work, or do you think that they're kind of
I
switched?
heard they're getting money from like the teal capital. So I don't know if it's
Gosh,
off.
I'm
Yeah.
still waiting for my check from him.
I don't know if it's opportunism or anything, but I definitely think that they get money from sort of like right libertarian groups for sure. They're really unpopular with people my age though. People like a lot of people my age hate them, especially
Oh yeah.
because they lean into reactionary politics like that.
Oh, okay.
But I
Yeah.
don't mind it. I think it's interesting. It's better to do something new than to not like, might as well do something new.
Do you
I
think
don't think
libertarianism might be on the rise after
yeah,
in the wake of the pandemic response and the impact that it's had on Gen Z?
I think you're starting to see not just like, not even outright libertarianism, just classic liberalism gain more and more traction as people get really frustrated with like the sort of fringe left and like the fringe like right. They're starting to get really frustrated with that, and they just want, sort of normal liberalism to take hold again.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's getting popular.
Do
So,
you, would you put yourself in that camp at this point in time?
yeah, I'd probably fall into like a sort of classical liberal, like politically homeless label where I don't really have any sort of like deep hatred of like the left or right as it stands right now. I hear some of their solutions or each side's, kind of like worldview and sort of solutions to whatever problems they've laid out as their problems. And I see where all of their arguments are. I don't think that they're in terms of some things that have subjective, like questions that are subjective themselves and answers that are subjective. I don't really have a problem with the right or left. I'm really just interested in maintaining sort of certain liberal maxims, like, a free society, ability to kind of like freely assemble, freely speak, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
What's your plan for 2022?
2022 is to write more and try to publish more, see if I can kind of go into um, a more formal writing career or something like that. Maybe even dial into podcasting, since that seems to be a great way to start conversations for sure. So that's about it really for 2022, and whatever the pandemic allows me to do, really. I'd like to be able to travel more in an ideal world, but The pandemic's really restricted that. One thing that with the pandemic that's like really happened, unfortunately, is like traveling's become a very privileged thing to be able to do. Like it's well gate kept now, especially like I had family come in from Canada, and like the family that came in was like relatively well off, and the amount of like money that they had to like sort of like pay just to get their testing done in time to be able to go back into the country, it's like, well, this isn't something that the average person can probably afford, let alone someone who is like underprivileged. So it's just the difference between the have and the have nots is like expanded further over the pandemic. I mean, that's kind of both a major right wing talking point and a left wing talking point right now, is that you saw a huge transition of wealth over the pandemic. Well, the congressional figures just got richer and richer over the pandemic too. So the people making our decisions, they're making a pretty penny off of this. I don't really think I blame, say for example, people who are like unvaccinated or anything like that. I don't blame them for their like pandemic skepticism or skepticism about like the vaccines and stuff like that, when the people making these mandates and stuff like that are probably financially benefiting from like these sorts of mandates, right? Whether or not it's like more like increasing government contracts with like these sort of pharmaceutical companies, and or very like deft investments in these sorts of things. Like I totally understand the skepticism. I don't know if I necessarily agree with it though, but
what's your take? It's just kind of like this big mess and just a bunch of self-interests, and it's just kind of falling out the way.
yeah. I think self-interest has made this pandemic as disorganized as possible for the West. And I think that when you look, there's like a really good Oxfam report on sort of vaccine inequity and how we are on our fourth dose here in the US, but then the most high risk categories outside of like the Western world, so particularly in like sub-Saharan Africa and stuff like that, the most at risk in those countries haven't even gone one dose yet. And a lot of that's gate kept by like sort of like the architecture of like the pharmaceutical industry. So the way that we're receiving our vaccines here in the United States has to do with a lot with the sort of government contracts made with like, Pfizer and Moderna, biotech, I think. And when reading the Oxfam report, they basically revealed that in terms of like actual production costs, like we are being held in a vice grip financially, like the United States is, by like these pharmaceutical companies, where they're sort of like charging us excessively for like these government contracts to get these vaccines to people. I know for Colombia, what was it, like an estimated like 300 million? They were overcharged like an estimated 300 million or something like that for their vaccine set. Something insane like that.
Columbia, the country or the college?
Oh, the country. Yeah.
Just clarify.
Yeah. It's just like, it's really shocking. Like just sitting down and just reading reports as to where money is being moved and who's getting paid with what and why is just sort of like absurd and depressing, I guess. I think that, there's a real information glut right now, or you're having what you could call information overload amongst the population, where there are just so many clear things to be upset about as a populace, but no one is able to actually organize or do anything meaningful with the information because there's just so much of it. I probably lean more nerdy than other people, where I am the type to sit around and pour over these documents and stuff like that, and like, become hyper concerned. But what about people who have like normal jobs, or, aren't college students and have kids to take care of and stuff like that? They don't have the time for this.
Well, it's a market.
Yeah. So the more you report on it, the more popular, the more popular you are. You can publish it and you can kind of like help people mobilize.
Mm-hmm.
There have been like a few journalists that have gotten really big over the pandemic who've been doing well. I think specifically like Glenn Greenwald's been doing a lot of work. A lot of people at The Intercept, like Matt Taibbi, stuff like that. They kind of fall into like the intellectual dark web type sort of like journalists, and they've been doing really good work actually. So on reporting just on vaccine inequities or
Hmm.
sort of narrative confusions and like narrative disorganization from the central government, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, Omicron came from South Africa. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
their rates of vaccination, but you could probably, well, insofar as it becomes seasonal and endemic, and hopefully just the ball just like the severity of infection just kind of bounces down and trends down. Insofar as that continues to happen, and insofar as the vaccines don't do much, I don't know to what extent vaccinating the entire world will help or hinder the virus, because if the virus is just going to keep on mutating and
Mm-hmm.
mutates even faster in non-vaccinated countries. I just wonder the math about that and how that works on an evolutionary biology level or something like that. The problem with this whole topic is that I'm so out of my depth that I don't even know what to say, other than people are going to benefit from it and people are going to be harmed by those who are benefiting from it,
Mm-hmm.
unless we can incentivize everybody benefiting somehow.
The biggest problem with the pandemic is the sort of like you have like the sort of professional class kind of like really alienating people who might not specialize in public health or, you know, science and medicine just generally. I don't really think you need to have like a really strong understanding of like public health or like, you know, math, science, whatever, to be able to kind of like look at policy and look at its outcomes and see whether or not it works and criticize it. I mean, like if you live under it, you should have the right to criticize it, in my
Mm.
opinion. And that doesn't mean like you then are like suddenly more knowledgeable or anything you say is more legitimate than like a health professional. It's just more, I think that, say, for example, business owners complaining about, you know, public health mandates ruining their careers, ruining their business, like that's a pretty fair policy related critique, you know, whether or not the closures were actually productive or not. I don't really think you need to be a really strong science guy to
Yeah.
be able to kind of look at things like that.
Think
It,
locally. Yeah, that's
yeah,
yeah, that's the extent of my purview. I don't like mandates, and I don't necessarily think we should vaccinate children.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't like the mandates. It's really shocking what the mandates are doing to like just business in general. Like they're decimating small business. In Philadelphia, there were a few like shocking cases where like businesses that have been around for like hundreds of years at this point shut down. Like there's this one place called City Tavern, and I'm pretty sure they organized like they've drafted oh man, I can't remember what one of the um, documents from one of the first Continental Congresses or something like that that was like drafted at this place called like the City Tavern in like the 1700s, like late 1700s, and that place like had been open for like what like 200 years at this point, shut down over the pandemic because they were getting no business, no foot traffic, nothing, and it's like wow, like it's this American history that's like getting like railroaded by these mandates and like at what cost, like you know that was there really any net benefit? Could they have done outdoor dining had that been enabled, because they closed quite early on in the pandemic too? So it's like really I'm really skeptical of these mandates, especially ones that really restrict sort of the public capacity for like risk assessment too. Like I think there's a real assumption from public health officials that the average person is too stupid to make risk calculus or like, you know, accurate or productive risk calculus too. I mean, like the vast majority of people won't be harmed by the virus. You know, it's a big thing. If you're under the age of like 60 or even younger than that, under the age of like 45, and you're in good health, I
Yeah.
don't really understand what there is to really like spend every day in fear of, especially if you're triple vaxxed at this point or even quadruple vaxxed.
Mhm. And
So
then demanding that everybody you come into contact with is the similar or more vaxxed than you are, even
yeah,
though they can still give it to you and you can still get it. I just don't, it just doesn't make sense. But I understand that fear is the mother of irrationality, and it's just
yeah.
what people are living in.
And when I did my paper on like you know, protest movements and stuff, I focused a lot on sort of like a comparison between like the measures taken by the American state the onset of the pandemic versus the Chinese state at the onset of the pandemic. And you have a lot of liberals who get upset if you suggest that like any of these measures being taken, like these mandates are draconian. They get quite upset about it. But when you look at things from the perspective of like the Hong Kongers who were affected, a lot of their protest was like able to be suppressed because of like the COVID mandates initially, right? Because you had, in January at sort of like, these protests reached their height, especially in the summer. They're going on right really strongly. As soon as that pandemic hit, you had the Chinese state working in tow with the pro-Chinese like Hong Kong government, the one under Carrie Lam, and they used the pandemic to shut down a public assembly. They used it to shut down, free discourse. They used contact tracing on basically everyone, which made actual like anonymous gathering impossible. If you have to constantly log where you are, if the government knows where you are at any given minute because they're tracking like the virus spread, I don't know how a democratic protest is supposed to go on. And then that went on for a few months. And then by the time the summer hit, they were able to implement the national security bill that the Hong Kong democracy protests had been trying to fight against. So, Americans, I think, tend to have it, they tend to look at everything through a lens of optimism, but then you can look at these other more authoritarian regimes and you're seeing like, real civil rights being taken away under the guise of like, public health measure. And it's just kind of shocking that people are just okay with it. Things are just, yeah. Like the Hong Kong protests, I don't think are going to go anywhere at this point. Like if it wasn't just the corporate sector, it was also the pandemic. With the U.S., the pandemic facilitated protests. So it's like the complete opposite. And you really saw, in spite of all the draconian measures, like the sort of enabling by like sort of the neoliberal and like progressive elites.
Well,
Of,
it doesn't.
like,
It
mass
doesn't harm
gathering.
them to to shuffle around some money and create more bureaucracy to solve the problem of racism in America in 2020, and root out white supremacy from our midst by throwing a bunch of by creating a bunch more bureaucrats. It doesn't harm them at all to reorganize Amazon Prime so you have black stories now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're never going to have an anti-pandemic or small business stories in that. That doesn't
Mm-hmm.
help Amazon to, or anti-China. You're not going to have problems with China in the Amazon thing. Like they're never going to
Yeah.
do that. So the race card is just, it's so easy for them to play. There's no reason for them not to play it.
The war on white supremacy that's going on right now is really going to go down in history, like amongst probably like Gen Alpha, my kids. It's going to go down as like the war on drugs or like the war on terror, a meaningless war against like some sort of abstraction that doesn't really tangibly exist. That is like a huge waste of, kind of government resources and enables a sort of like real shift in like, you know, power, like like I don't know. I think that looking back in 10 years, we're really going to regret enabling a lot of these sorts of like bureaucratic expansion. The war on white supremacy, like you look at like rates of like sort of like white terrorism in the country, and it's like way less way less severe than I think it looks on paper or in like conversations with like democratic politicians and stuff like that. Like they really act like, minorities wake up every day afraid of like white people or something like that, which is like absurd. It's absurd. I mean, if anything, like I think the United States is probably one of the least racist countries you could like live in, honestly, because racism elsewhere is really bad. And you don't hear about it because racism is really bad. You don't hear about discrimination elsewhere because it never gets talked about. They just oppress whatever racial minority they have and you just kind of forget about them. I mean, I feel like a perfect example would be, and like, obviously it's not a perfect comparison because like the actual like mechanics of these politics are kind of like complicated, but like at least in China, as an example, like most of the focus narrative wise, especially in the West, is on the dominant racial group in China, which is the Han Chinese. And then you never hear anything about other like minority groups unless it's like, say, for example, like sort of like the current like suppression in the Xinjiang province that we're seeing now with their Uyghur minority group. But even then, obviously there are a lot of like real complicated, like there are a lot of narrative issues with the sort of Xinjiang, like, provinces politics right now. So I won't really want to get into that. But like the biggest point is that like American racial politics dominate global discourse. They just do. And people don't seem to realize it. Like, because I'm Japanese and I have a lot of friends from Japan and stuff like that, I really got to see what the Japanese response was to Black Lives Matter. And like the fact that Black Lives Matter has chapters in Tokyo and Kyoto and all these other major cities in Japan is really enough for me to like, it's really enough for the public to basically admit that like, hey, maybe the sort of plight of the African American in America isn't so bad, right? Like it's able to garner like global like sort of attention, right? And it has for like centuries and centuries at this point. People have been interested in our racial politics here for a long time. So I just don't understand why Democrat politicians and progressive politicians, neoliberal politicians, that whole circle of like sort of like broader liberal left people, I don't know how they don't see that, or why do they pretend otherwise?
Well, it's part of their narrative. It's part of their business. It's part of their interests. It's part of the brand. It's built into the brand at this point. And they can trot out, and they get to reignite that narrative every time something doesn't go their way. If a politician loses in Virginia, it's because of white women. Thinking that CRT is being taught in school is, just some sort of weird white supremacy trick to continue with the white supremacy thing. Kyle Rittenhouse gets released. It's white supremacy, everything. And you just relive it. It's like, like my joke, whenever it happens, I re-release my joke that I'm going to teach my toddler democratic politics or strategy so that every time she doesn't get her way, she can cry "Racist," right? Just to be able to hear that, to do that. So I guess one way is just to see through it and to call it out for what it is and focus on what? Race? Focus more on race? Are we getting tired of that narrative yet? Are you tired of that narrative? Is it still alive and well? And how long can it live and breed?
I think I'd fall into the category amongst my peers that's extremely unpopular with my politics on this, and that like I'm completely sick of race. I'm sick of racial discourse, like I really like I used to really buy into like these sorts of racial like politics when I was younger, and I really became disillusioned with them over the course of like the Black Lives Matter protests and riots that happened in 2020. And a lot of it really had to do with the fact that like I talked to my dad about it. And my dad was like a lot older. He passed away last year. So, I'm really fortunate to have been able to spend time with someone that has so much like sort of just like general, like historical, like experience. And he told me that, he's an African-American man, grew up during segregation. He told me that the protests during Black Lives Matter were like the riots were worse than what he saw after MLK died, like just shortly afterward. And that's when I like really like had to sit down and like think about things. I don't live in a world that's nearly as difficult or harsh as the one that he grew up in. So I don't know why I'm still sitting around today acting like I do. And I don't know how other people are as well. And, when you talk to a lot of liberals about this, they're just kind of like, well, we had segregation, like just like in the 60s and blah, blah, blah. Like it's recent American history. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's the thing with time. Change happens quickly. 1 year is 1 year is enough for so much change. Like it's been like, at least if you were to count like an entire like, generational span as like a 20-year, like sort of like,
block,
block, we've been through like what, like four or five cycles at this point of just like people being born and reaching adulthood, right? And in that time, like it's just like to say that there hasn't been any change is kind of like absurd, or really diminishes all the actions and all the achievements of people in the past. I would never argue that this country was never racist. I mean, I think the foundations of this country were built on really complicated racial politics, especially being like an immigrant country where you had all these people from like different European groups come over. You had a ton of conflict with like disparate native groups in the United States. You had like the transatlantic slave trade, all of these like harsh narratives of like, segregation, discrimination, subjugation. But like we're living in 2022 at this point, and like the sort of like supposition that like it's in any way, shape, or form comparable to what it once was is like absurd to me. And that's why I think like the sort of war on white supremacy concept is really like a political tactic. It's a political tactic, and they're doing what they can to prey on people's emotions, to make people feel afraid of one another, to make minorities feel afraid of white people again. And I don't know why. Like, especially in conservative spaces, they'll accuse like Republicans and stuff of being racist. But the people I've met who are the most afraid of being seen as racist are conservatives because they know it will hurt them. They know that it will ruin their career. You know, silly. I don't really think people should live in fear of that sort of stuff. It's definitely something that really like, not just breaks my heart kind of
Hmm.
to hear some of the rhetoric that kind of like gets spewed, but it's just really disheartening to also see people my age get so caught up into this like sort of fiction. And you can obviously like you can already like kind of like see a perfect example of it in terms of like how media censorship works. Like if you go on Twitter and you look up I hate black people, you might find maybe like one anonymous account, two anonymous accounts, three anonymous accounts saying this, and you could just report them, they'll get banned. Like, it's in no time. You look up I hate white people, you have tons and tons of teenagers, young adults, people in their up to like in their 30s who are minorities tweeting about how much they hate white people and stuff like that, and they feel completely justified in it because they like sort of attach themselves to this victimhood narrative, like this racial victimhood narrative that justifies hatred towards another group. And you can't do anything, you can't say anything about it, they don't get censored because it's part of their free speech, and they like project themselves as being in this sort of like racial underclass that doesn't actually exist. Like I'm sure that there are plenty of racist people still to this day if you like go on the like I don't know if you seek them out, but on average I think they're far and few, and like they're far and few in between. Like there aren't very many people like that anymore. A lot of them are really old too. Like sometimes I'll hear stories about like really elderly racist people, and I'm like, well, they're probably going to pass away in like another like 10 years. Doesn't matter what they think. They're not doing anything important. They're not
Hmm.
influencing anyone. I don't know. But I trend toward having a really unpopular take on that, those American racial politics for sure, because I just don't really think that there is an issue in the same way. A lot like when people talk about like black people being disenfranchised and alienated from opportunity, that has way more to do with just like generational poverty in the community. It doesn't have to do with like a sort of like outside like sort of bigotry limiting options. If anything, now because of all the diversity and like equity and like sort of affirmative action programs that exist, like you can be a relatively underqualified like minority and still find like great opportunity to improve yourself now more than ever before. you know it's just, I don't know, it's just absurd. It's like so unfortunate to see people my age act like they're more victimized somehow on the basis of their race when they're not, because it's not just that it's not just that it's incorrect. It's like a mental trap. It's like a mental poison or a mental disease, sort of like it really will ruin your self-esteem if you look at the world like that. And like I don't know if they realize it, like to look at the world like this sort of like abstraction of like a white establishment is your enemy. That's a really unhealthy way to view things and to view like human dynamics. So I don't know how to break people out of that.
Hmm. Have you
Yeah.
had any luck?
No, I think I made a tweet making a joke about it, and then I got dogpiled on by a bunch of like woke black people. And it was like really like not fun because when they feel justified in being racist, they will be racist against you. So, I had like a lot people tell me I wasn't truly black, that my experience is like I was just like some light skin, like all of these things, even though I'm technically two minority groups in one. But, it's because I went against the grain. So people will get really frustrated and mad. And it was a lot of people. It was like a few hundred to like, because like I had a tweet that got pretty popular of me criticizing me on an old account, and like they were like vicious. They were mad, and they, you know, like, there was something I criticized that got me a lot of flack too, and I got a lot more popular than I thought. It was like another popular tweet that was basically like, there's this musician named No Name or something like that. She's like a black, like Pan-African, like Marxist or something like that. And I think there was like a news article that was like, oh, she is only like, she's basically making a racially segregated concert where only black people are allowed to go. But like, I guess it really actually affected her ticket sales, because I don't really know who other than upper class white people is listening to like NPR Marxist rap. But but she tried to segregate her concert and it just did not work. And I made a joke about her, like kind of like shitted on her for it. And I had a bunch of her fans get like really mad at me. And I mean, I don't care at the end of the day. Like, Twitter is not a real place, but it's just kind of like, oh, wow. Like, these are people who can vote. These are people whose votes matter, you know, and they think this. There are just so many cases of just like really poor logic coming out of like the sort of like almost like like new identitarianism that's picking up, like the black identitarianism that's picking up. It's not even black radicalism like we saw in like the 70s with like the Black Panthers and stuff like that, when they're really fighting for self-sufficiency and self-reliance from the black community. Like it's sort of like, and I wrote a Substack article on this, and I kind of coined like, I didn't coin a term or anything like that, but the best way to describe it is like a sort of exceptionalist politics. You're seeing like a sort of like exceptionalism amongst the black community, where they view like the strife of the African American as being wholly unique, against all like, you know, global discrimination, all judgment, anything like that, you know. And like, it's not a supremacy movement, because they're not projecting that black people are better than other people. They're doing precisely the opposite, where they're sort of like projecting an image of the African American race as like as composing like an underclass in American racial society, you know. And you know, therefore that like entitles them to the correction of like certain indemnities or something like that,
in perpetuity. And and I don't know the correct term, but any given member of that group can claim absolute victim status at any given time. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter where they are, like in what discussion they're in. They can claim that, and they're entitled to that. And that problem with that entitlement is that, and I saw this at the Evergreen State College, and then I saw it on Clubhouse a lot. And then it happens in Twitter Spaces every once in a while too, like where these racial things that go on, and you witness that level. And oddly enough, I've seen it from black males and black females, but the black females go absolutely nuclear with this stuff.
I've noticed,
and it's really intense when they do, and it's kind of stupid too, because it doesn't go anywhere. They just they shit on everybody, and they're terrible to everybody, and there's no reasoning at all. And even people who were reasonable up until that moment, as soon as that switch happens, they just go into this other place, and they start just hating white people. And it's like, whoa, this is not good for your soul. It's not good for your movement. It's not good for anybody except for you in this moment. And I guess whoever wants to perpetuate that behavior, and I'm not criticizing black Americans. I think that's obvious. I'm just criticizing the entitlement that is given to this game, that is particularly given and fostered within certain activist black communities or woke spaces.
It's so scary to speak against these people. It's so scary, because they will try to ruin your career. They will do what they can. They'll try to get your name.
Well, you're more targeted than I am, because you are closer. You would poke. You're more of a threat to the narrative than I am. So they'll pretty much just leave me alone. And I'm already a racist. I'm already lost. But they have to performatively cast out. They have to performatively crucify you or anybody who's
Yeah.
progressive. It happened to somebody who was Jewish last year who wanted to, do something for Asians, and he got
Mhm.
completely crucified. There's a great article on
Yeah.
that I can link to.
They really they really do get really particularly aggressive. And like I remember when I first started like kind of expressing my opinion on racial politics, and I was trying to approach it kind of from an angle of like, isn't this ridiculous? Like this is insane, and I wasn't too familiar with how entrenched like the social activism was. And like I find them the scariest because like they will do like they get really aggressive online in online spaces, and both in real life too. Like I know I think I said this to you in a previous conversation we had, where at some point in school, I had taken a class on pluralist politics in the United States, pluralism, and it we were analyzing sort of like these ad campaigns, like social activist campaigns and stuff like that. And one involved like some white guy dressed like a Jamaican man, like rapping or doing something like that for to raise money for like the bees. It's like a whole thing. The whole point is that is an advertisement campaign, and this white guy was like doing cultural, quote unquote, cultural appropriation. And I think at some point, like there were obviously a few like more like activist type college students who were like, Black women, in my class. And I remember at some point raising my hand and just saying like, I get that's cultural appropriation, but if they raise like 2 million for the bees, I don't really see why it's a big deal. Like what was like the method not great, sure, but the outcome was fantastic. And I just got kind of berated in class by this activist girl. She was like, no, oh, like we are not excusing like cultural appropriation and blah blah blah, like don't suck up to white people, like that sort of thing. And I was like slack jawed in class because I just couldn't believe it. I come from a small farming town in New Jersey. So when I really got to New York and I met like the more like sort of New York sort of like neoliberal like activist girls, I was like really like, ooh, like, like these sorts of woke politics were like completely foreign to me coming into school. So I was just like shocked, and like I couldn't believe it. And I feel like a lot of it, I don't want to invalidate the experiences of other people or anything like that, because I really think personal experience is crucial to developing a worldview. But from my personal experience growing up with like a dad that like lived through segregation, you know, like because like my stepdad, he was born in the 20s. He was born in 1921. So he would have lived through all of it. He was excluded from the GI Bill, everything like that, but he didn't really have negative things to say about white people. Like he was scared of white people from time to time. Like he felt nervous. Like, we went to a beach that used to be segregated when he was a child, and that wasn't segregated anymore. And he was still really afraid to go on the beach because he was worried about being like persecuted against. But it was fine. We even met people at the beach that day who were kind to us and became friendly and talked to my dad about fishing and stuff like that. When my dad was a child, his best friends included a Jewish boy and a Polish boy, and they were friends until the end of their lives. And it's not all, it doesn't all function in like this sort of like dualistic, like, white versus black, like, you know, that like there's no like black or white dichotomy that exists in the way that like a lot of these activists want to pretend. And like they have to keep projecting that in order to succeed in any way, so
What are some of the biggest things that your dad taught you?
he taught me just to try to be good to other people, to try to stay level, especially in conversations with other people or contentious conversations. He also taught me that life isn't ever going to be easy. Life is never easy. It doesn't matter how lucky you are or anything. Like my favorite, like a quote that I always live by from him is just that life is a constant struggle. It's always a constant struggle. And I also suspect that a lot of these activist groups and stuff like that, they don't seem to realize that for everyone else, life is a struggle too. Just even for white people, even for, racial minorities, it's just a struggle. And like, it's really hard to like, sort of like try to weigh like an individual subjective experience of life against someone else's, obviously, like, does race play a huge part in your experiences? For sure. Absolutely, 100%. Racial discrimination, absolutely 100% can play a role in that. But, to then say that, therefore, you're more entitled to XYZ thing, I don't know if that's true. Like, that was not something I was taught growing up. I don't think my dad, through all the really like racist, like discriminatory experiences he went through, I don't think he really expected anything that was like, I guess, quote unquote, undeserved in life. So like my dad had like bad experiences too. Like I know when he was a kid and like he ran away from home when he was like 13 and was living in New York by himself and was doing like a bunch of different like odd jobs, and he got arrested by this one. There was like some Italian shop owner that really didn't like him for some reason, and I think it was because he was black, really hated him, and kept calling the cops on him. And he actually got arrested one time and thrown in jail for a few days. And I was like the most upset he had ever been in his life. And the guy was so racist to him and terrible to him, but he was long dead by the time my dad reached adulthood. And I don't really know if at the end of the day it really mattered or anything. Like my dad still accomplished so many different things in his life, you know what I mean? So it's like sort of like how limiting that is too, I really question as well.
Mm.
I mean,
what were some of his accomplishments?
He was a really well accomplished painter, like well accomplished skater too. Like he won a few different awards in the 50s and 60s and stuff for artistic roller skating, which I think is like kind of like quirky and kind of cool. I remember really liking that growing up with like tons and tons of trophies in our house and stuff. And like he had a ton of like friends that were white and whatnot, in the skating organization that he was at. Like, yeah, they dealt with like racism. They were racist people, but not every white person was evil back then. Like that's like a weird projection, I think, that comes from like a sort of detachment from history that you're seeing now as like time goes on, is like this idea that everyone back then was racist and like angry. It's the same thing I mentioned before. Like if you look at generations as like a 20-year block from birth to adulthood, like you're seeing rapid change in like the sort of like attitudes of people. So by the time my dad was in his like, I don't know, 40s to 60s and stuff like that, attitudes had really changed. Like they were starting to change. And again, this isn't to say that people weren't racist. People were very racist, but there were a lot of like shining like gems, that were still there. That like I don't think that he would have had the experiences he did if it wasn't for some people that he met that weren't black. So I don't know, when you talk to like black elders and like when you talk to black elders, it really like also calls in like things into real question, I think. I mean, my dad was probably braver than other people at when he was younger too. Like he was probably more inclined to try to interact with white people, but he was probably more inclined than other people to interact with the white other, I guess. So I don't know if that really influences anything. So my mom is Japanese, so she was really someone who made me realize that racism was like really bad elsewhere. Like in Japan, like the way that Zainichi Koreans get treated, so like that would be like our like immigrant like Korean population, I mean, they get treated terribly. Same with like Chinese and stuff like that, minorities. You can actually, there are less protections or like legal protections for racial minorities in say Japan than there are in the US. So I don't really understand the sort of projection that like it's all so unique here, so elsewhere it gets really bad.
Did you well, I guess being very diverse, you're very unique cultural, where two rivers meet. I can't remember the term for that, but being Japanese and then your biological father's Jamaican, very unique. So growing up in a farm town in rural New Jersey, probably not likely that you're not going to be aware of or have a racial consciousness. Did you have a racial consciousness? When did you start to become aware of that? And how long did that last? And how heavy was that? Or how much did it impact your relationship to other people and to your environment and to yourself? And
My concept of race was really affected by living in a rural uh, farming town, I guess, because I think that more so than anywhere else, that's where you will meet people who are really racist, like actually racist. And I don't mean racist like, oh, like I said, like a micro transgression or some microaggression, did a microaggression to you. Like that was something I learned in college as existing, like where you could like accidentally be racist or like project like some sort of idea of racism through something that's like to anyone else would come off as totally innocuous. Like that's something I learned in college as like a thing. But like I remember being really young and like no, like I would be in like 4-H, you know, that's like the little farming uh
grow some
community group.
pigs and share some
Yeah.
corn.
Yeah, I used to like grow, like I used to like milk goats and stuff like that and help with like horse, like take care of horses and whatnot. And there was like one family that I met there that the two girls, they were a little bit younger than me and they really had wanted to be friends with me. And their mom like they were hanging out with me one day and then their mom came and just like started slapping the girls and stuff like that and was like, oh, like we need to leave, like blah 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 blah. And I think they called me the n-word, I'm not really sure, but my mom just was like, you know, I was really sad that day because I was still in like grade school, so I didn't really understand why they didn't want to, like why they weren't allowed to play. But my mom told me a few years later that she was pretty sure their parents were in the Klan. Like they're pretty sure because they had like a knight sticker on the back of their car and stuff like that. So like they were definitely like in the KKK. And like I felt really bad because like, you know, I feel like there's like a sort of image of like these KKK members as being like these really like well enfranchised and like sort of you know, like entrenched like sort of like establishment figures, but they're not like that family was like low, like poor, like they were poor, they were probably doing worse than my family, right? I doubt their parents went to college, right? I don't know what economic opportunities those girls really had. So you know, growing up in a farm town, you really do meet people who subscribe to like these really like racist ideologies and stuff like that, but I don't really know if they're going anywhere in life, you know.
Were you able to see that? Did it cause irrevocable damage to your ego sense of self to be categorized as a lesser race or an untouchable race?
Oh yeah, it fucked me up as a kid. Like it
Really?
definitely like destroyed my self-esteem as a kid. Like I felt anxious, like I felt really anxious interacting with my white friends. Like I definitely felt like, you know, the other because like whenever I would go to like school events or like any sort of like extracurricular programs, I was not white white. And a big thing too is that even though I grew up in like like I grew up in a farm town, that doesn't mean the farm town was primarily white either. Like there were a lot of like Hispanic and Black people. Like there's a huge like just general Hispanic diaspora in the town I grew up in, and you know a lot of them came as like sort of like agricultural workers. Their parents worked in like agriculture and they came from Puerto Rico or they came from Mexico and stuff like that. But even then I felt like an other because I was something different, right? I was Asian and Black. So no matter like in Black circles, I didn't feel as comfortable. In Latin circles, I didn't really feel as comfortable. And especially in white like circles, I felt really alienated. And as I got older, and I graduated and I was able to leave my home for college, that's when I really realized that like, oh, that was like in my head. That was in my head, you know? Like these sorts of like this sort of racial insecurity was in my head, you know, because like at the end of the day, the people that discriminated against me weren't going to like me in the first place. So I didn't need to worry about them. I didn't need to care about them. And they were like negligible, you know, if you weren't going to like me in the first place, you know, I won't worry about you sort of, you know. I live by the quote, it's like an Azalea Banks quote or something where it's like like your problem with me isn't my problem, sort of. And that was a really the mentality you have to take on to get over that sort of like racial insecurity, because when you go out into the real world, most people are welcoming, most people are kind, you know. A lot more people, they don't have real racial biases beyond just not knowing. You know, a lot of people just don't know anything, and you can't fault them for that.
Well, I mean, if somebody's unkind and race is a way to exercise that unkindness, or if somebody's in pain, racism or tribalism or hate, broadly speaking, is a way for them to express that problem or, you know, perform being mean if that's what they want to do. But I don't think it's a lot of energy, and only broken people tend to act that way. And you know, if there are racial systems in place that were established that need to be changed, we can change that. But if you're walking around and you're a kind person and you're a nice person and you're a funny person, you're a pretty person, most people are just going to be attracted to you and
Yeah,
get
for
along
sure.
with you. And yeah.
I mean, that I honestly think that like because we talked about the level of like aggressiveness that comes from a lot of like the more prominent black activists, particularly female, and a lot of that meanness comes from a place of like being broken. In my eyes, like I think a lot of the aggression comes from a place of being broken, because when you sit down and like you look at like the early histories of like notable activists, like an example would be there are like three activists that helped organize the Black Lives Matter organization. And if you look at their family backgrounds and stuff like that, they didn't necessarily come from like good family backgrounds, you know, not they weren't just black, they also came from abusive, difficult families. um you know, a lot of them too, like a major thing with Black Lives Matter is that like the organizers, a lot of them aren't straight, they're queer. And in, you know, there is, it's not talked about, and I don't know why it's not talked about, but I certainly think homophobia is a problem in the black community for sure. So sometimes I wonder if like the sort of New York activist groups that you see are driven by something that isn't entirely rational, and something that is like extremely emotionally like, based. I mean, like, so part of my thesis was looking at kind of like the makeup of Black Lives Matter and whether or not well represented members of the African American community. And if you go on the Black Lives Matter page, not so much now, since I think they've really toned down the radicalism as the movement got popular and started getting more media attention. But you can find web archives of like their, you know, sort of about us page and like their like sort of goals and like blah blah blah. Like they were like explicitly like queer, pro LGBT, like they're like,
Communist.
yeah, like we want to destroy like the nuclear family, subvert the nuclear family. We want to make a space for queer black people and queer BIPOC, blah 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 blah. But then when you look at the statistical like data on like sexual identities amongst the black community, it's like less than like 2% of black people are gay, you know, or like LGBTQ identifying. And so like that's like 13% of the population, and then 2% of that population, like a sliver of a minority group that gets represented in the media. So like say you see like the Black Trans Lives Matter slogan, you're probably familiar with like that whole rhetoric. And that gets like kind of like, you know, like proliferated, but no one ever looks at who is committing like these hate crimes against black trans women. Because like I do agree with like the whole like rhetoric that like black trans women are like extremely like they do face a lot of like danger on a day-to-day basis. A lot of them come from extremely poor backgrounds, a lot of them deal with severe mental health issues, like blah 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 blah. But whenever I find cases of like them being victims of like a hate crime, the perpetrator is almost always black, another black male. Like there's a video that went viral last year, I think, and this must have been like the worst moment of this like woman's entire life, where like she was like this black trans woman, and she had been beaten by a group of 20 men on camera. Like they recorded it for fun, like stomping on her or something like that. Just horrible violence. All of those guys were black, I could see on the video, you know? So sort of like, but then you have the group, like the whole like Black Lives Matter group projecting this to represent all Black people. And it's like, okay, do you represent all Black people? Do you only represent progressive Black people who are not like who don't lend themselves to like sort of like bigoted like behaviors? Because like regardless of whether or not you agree with like trans and gender politics or something like that, you shouldn't be attacking people, you shouldn't be hurting people, and you shouldn't be causing anyone else pain. That's like should be like a status quo accepted thing. I don't care what your pronouns are, I'll treat you nicely no matter what, sort of. But yeah, a lot of those people are Black, and they act like it's like a white supremacy is like the threat against it, when it's really homophobia in the Black community, you know.
Yeah, the
lot of it
problem with
stems
victimhood is that you can't take responsibility or clean up your own. I'm not talking about the Black community. I'm just talking about activism and activistic mindset and the victim mindset that goes with it, and the kind of the Marxist conflict theory is that once you start going to, and this happens with certain brands of feminism, and it happens within certain men's rights organizations, just any group that adopts the victim mentality, it erodes the ability to take responsibility and to start from, the ground up, and take care of yourself, make yourself in charge, make your own way in the world, and then help those lesser down on, the totem pole than you. If you adopt this, the society's against us, we're oppressed, then you can't even afford to be imperfect, because that would mean that those people over there that are evil are you're more closer to them than you think, if your own community is committing hate crimes against other marginalized groups.
Yeah, and Black Lives Matter as like a sort of representational entity is like they're trying to be as intersectional and inclusive as of all Black people, and in doing so, and by organizing their politics into something woke or progressive, they end up alienating so many Black people that aren't woke, because like a lot of Black people really aren't necessarily attuned to like sort of radical politics in the first place. Like I think the average Black person, if you were to ask why they support Black Lives Matter, their rationale would stem from like a fear of police violence and a fear of white supremacy that's like, I think in part been really inflated by these activist groups. And so that's why you see such consistent voting patterns without deviation. And then you have aggressive punishment of like kind of like African Americans who dare to like present themselves as Republican or conservative or in any way, So even though conservatism and republicanism has a lot to do with like where you're living and sort of like how certain policies affect you. So like perfect example would be my dad was a registered Republican his entire life, from the get-go during the party switch up until the end of his life, even though he voted Democrat for the last several years. But that was because we grew up, like we were living in a rural farming community, So like, of course he would support Republican policies that benefited like the rural regions of the United States. Like politics isn't just about race, right? It's about like your like economic gain to some degree. But yeah, just generally Black Lives Matter is like really like sort of narrowed its purview into like progressive politics, and that inadvertently really alienates a lot of Black people. And I think
we started saying from the get-go, but the money is just it's basically a fundraising arm for the Democratic Party.
It really is.
If you actually trace where the money goes, it does not go into the communities.
Yeah,
it goes into the leaders and then the Democratic establishment.
Yeah, it goes to the bureaucrats, it goes to the activists, it goes to basically anyone that like can enable another Democrat win during these midterms, anyone who can enable a Democrat win in 2024. And, there have been so many issues with polling too. So like I was doing my research paper trying to quantify like, progressivism amongst the Black community. And like you find like these polls published by like Huffington Post and Mother Jones and like, like the whole like liberal news outlets, like the progressive outlets. And they'll talk about how like broadly like the Black community is pro gay or like pro this and pro that. And I'm like, well, who are you polling? Like, they're presenting these as fact, but like if your like survey group is in the thousands, that doesn't represent all Black people. Like how many Black people probably didn't even know this polling, like polling method exists, right? Like the whole issue, especially now with voter IDs, is that like Black people are somehow politically disenfranchised, right? And they need to be enfranchised through like an abolishment of like the voter ID regulations, blah, 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 blah. But
And then if we go ahead with the vaccine mandate pass or the vax pass, the
mhm.
black community is going to be completely, if you go by
Yeah.
them,
Mhm.
their take on the vax. So we want voting rights, but yeah, it's just this weird tension
Yeah,
there.
like it's like the liberals don't know what to attribute, like what things to attribute to what, if that makes sense. Like they're having a lot of trouble with representation. They're having a lot of trouble with attribution as well. So like say for example, the narrative on vaccines is like there's like this overwhelming focus from like liberal communities to be like, oh well, BIPOC people are being underserved in terms of the vaccine access, blah 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 blah. Like we need to get the black community vaccinated. These white Trump supporters won't get vaccinated, and they portray the unvaccinated as being primarily like white Republican. And that is true, I think, for the white cohort of like the unvaccinated, but like there are significant swaths of the black community that refuse to get vaccinated. They just don't trust the state enough. They don't trust the medical establishment. A lot of them are working class or lower class, and they're not
Hmm.
particularly medically literate. So even like a lack of medical literacy or like that doesn't lend itself to seeking vaccination. It probably discourages vaccination because you don't understand the literature if you're already distrustful of the state. And you can just look at Philadelphia alone. If you look at a concentration map of like sort of vaccination in Philadelphia, you'll find that the primarily white areas have very high vaccination rates. As you go north to the city, where more lower income black people live, vaccination rates drop substantially. And in on like January 3rd or something, the city implemented like this like citywide mandate to bar unvaccinated people from public spaces, basically. So you can't go eat at a restaurant, can't go to music venues, can't do this, can't do that. And they're portraying it as like this big liberal win when they've inadvertently segregated the city because most of the people in the city that are vaccinated are primarily white. So what, like I guess like low income black people can't go to a restaurant, like they can't go to a venue, like they can't go to the movies, like
No, they can as long as they're working there
oh yeah, for
and
sure.
serving everybody food.
Oh yeah, that's another thing with the vax mandates that are just absolutely hilarious is that like especially with smaller businesses, they can't afford to maintain like the sort of like facade of like like following the mandate or anything like that. Like they can't maintain it. Like these businesses are relying on like frequently undocumented workers, they're relying on a lot of lower income workers. I've worked in restaurants before, and like I can completely imagine that like they're not mandating the back of house staff to get like in any like eating establishment to get vaccinated. A lot of those people would probably fall into like the vaccine hesitant category, you know. So like I have a friend who is currently, I think she's working as a bartender at some restaurant somewhere in the city, and she told me, I won't obviously specify where, and I'm not going to specify who, but she told me that they were having back-to-back infections from their wait staff, back-to-back infections, because a lot of the people working there, first of all, were not white. A lot of them were like in their 20s, 30s, obviously working in a service position. So like, they were living paycheck to paycheck. They couldn't afford to quarantine for 10 days, and not come into work. A lot of them didn't trust the vaccines and stuff like that. And I don't really know if their manager was really like enforcing it because they needed as many bodies as possible. Because like there's been really, real bad staff shortage recently. So,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, so you have to be vaccinated to go sit at a restaurant and eat, but the guy serving you probably doesn't have to be, and the guy making your food's probably not either. And they might have even been sick recently. And then you have liberal politicians being like, "What? I can't believe that Omicron's spreading. I can't believe it. We've only created policy that's not realistic in the slightest and is based on like some fantasy of how we think the world works and not how it actually does." Like if your business is dying, if your business has been like decimated over the last 2 years, are you really gonna, as a manager, mandate like vaccine passports? Are you gonna be able to afford and pay for a bouncer to check every single like vaccine card? Are you gonna be able to are you gonna be willing to cut staff that refuse to get vaccinated? I mean, that's kind of why a lot of hospitals have been like short staffed with nurses and stuff, because like huge swaths of like the nursing like occupation, they don't want to get vaccinated. No one really seems to question that except just like, oh, these medical professionals are stupid, you know? Like you see nurses and stuff like that get called dumb online for like
Well,
refusing the
yeah, but
vaccine.
they're really good dancers. You have to
Yeah.
give them that. They're really good at dancing.
I find that so bizarre that during a pandemic they would want to gut nursing staff like that's absurd to me. Even if they're not vaccinated, that doesn't mean they can't just do the labor. It means that they're taking on that risk willingly. I don't know. I think personally, if I worked at a hospital, I would want to get vaccinated. I would want to get like quadruple boosted and have like my mask on and everything like that because, COVID is a really real like respiratory illness. But like, if you don't want to get vaccinated, does it make sense to cut the people that would are working on the ground to keep people alive? I don't know about that. And then when you factor in minorities and stuff like that, how much of the health sector is like a minority too, like it's
Hmm.
such a mess. Like there are all these avenues in which like the policy obviously doesn't work, from the perspective of them using like subjective racial politics to determine like material politics, like to like this sort of like vaccine discrimination that whether like might be valid from a public health standpoint, but just isn't from like a actual like objective standpoint in terms of getting things done, getting people to where they need to go, getting positions like needed working positions filled. Like it's just like it's such a mess, you know.
There's a lot of work to do
Mm-hmm.
if you're keen on writing about this and speaking about this. What's next on your plate for your Substack? Are you
Um,
out of college? You're free now? All you have to do is work in the service industry and dodge the variants and write things?
uh, I think I have about a few courses left because I took a
Okay.
gap year because I didn't really want to pay tuition for online courses because the universities they were charging the tuition increased over the pandemic, but our classes weren't online. Like we're all online. So I didn't want to pay for that. So I took a year off. And now that we're back in person, I'm trying to go back to school. I have like maybe like a semester and a half left. I finished my thesis already, so the bulk of my degree is done. It's really just getting in those like last few requirements. And then from there on, I'll probably be studying for my LSATs. So hopefully get into a good law school or law program.
Yeah, I can see you in a think tank.
Yeah, that I would love to get like an internship at a think tank or something. It seems like they're publishing work that gets read by people that can make change or have the capacity to finance change. Be really good. Just some think tanks are better like than others. Some think tanks lean explicitly partisan too, which is like always a danger when you're putting something on your resume. That's like something I've been realizing more and more. Is people, especially in a politicized time, if you, it's really like a team sports situation. So if you sort of associate with the wrong people, then people on the other side will get mad.
Yeah.
It's like I don't really care about team sports. I just want solutions to problems. I don't really care.
Well,
Um, like the CRT thing that's like going on. Critical race theory.
oh yeah, I know critical race theory. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a massive debate. I read about that Evergreen State College thing, and I wouldn't explicitly say that that was like about CRT itself, but it certainly is an extension of it, of the broader issue. There's like one side that sees it as a problem, one side that denies it as a problem completely. I know like there's like arguments made by like uh, liberals that like this is like something created specifically by like I think you've had James Lindsay on.
Yep.
Yeah, as like you're friends with him. Then there's like Chris Rufo and stuff
Yep.
like that, and they're like the right-wing activists that are arguing against CRT, and like I think a lot of their arguments are pretty valid, but they get completely shot down or like laughed off by liberals who pretend as though they're making up this idea of an issue. But like the whole thing and the crisis with CRT is that it's like a pedagogical structure. So it's not something that they're teaching people. They're using as it's like a framework for a thought. It's architecture for like academics
And
and
it's taught
education.
explicitly within education schools.
Yeah.
Teachers are taught to practice critical race theory. The executive vice president of Evergreen, he was running the Race and Pedagogy Institute, and I have all these projects by all these teachers in Washington State trying to show how they're going to teach second graders critical race theory explicitly. It's like, okay, so it's not in school. So,
I mean, like, there was like a Smithsonian thing that I remember looking at that was kind of like, what is whiteness in society? And they called like critical thinking a white construct or
individualism, punctuality.
And like, that's still up on the Smithsonian website, I think on the page for like, it's like on the site for like African American studies or something like that. And like the fact that that's taught alone, and then like you have liberals denying that it's a problem or it exists, critical race theory as an issue, is like insane. Well,
I don't know if liberals are doing it so much as liberal media, or the liberal pundit. It's really difficult to tell what that entire swath of people is doing, but I do know the narratives.
Progressives.
The progressives.
Probably
I do know the narratives.
More accurately, progressives. Unfortunately, progressivism and liberalism now seems to go hand in hand a lot. So like if you're a liberal but you're not progressive, you get kind of like
you're kicked out.
You get cut out of the conversation. Like I'm not a progressive person in the slightest. I just want to see like extreme change soon, but I'm not progressive, so you get
extremes change soon. That should be your coffee mug.
Yeah. I don't care what kind of change, just something extreme.
Well, okay. So you don't mind if it's the French Revolution or something?
Yeah. No, I'm definitely like an English Revolution type person. Like a nice calm transition.
Yeah. A little Revolutionary War, a couple of little skirmishes here and there, but a nice solid document and a country off to world renown. Look, I got a jam. I gotta go.
Okay, yeah, great conversation.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Hopefully we can organize something again soon.
Yeah, if you want to do a panel-like discussion, if you have somebody you want to speak with while I host, let me know. Or if you have...
it'd be really cool to talk to James Lindsay. I really like his work right now. I got Cynical Theories over Christmas break, and I've been flipping through that whenever I have free time. It's great. Really good work.
He's a sharp fellow. We do a talk now about once a month or so, and he goes off on the latest thing. He's doing his next book's race Marxism. So it's right up there.
Have you had a chance to check out any work by John McWhorter?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, I haven't read his recent book. I listened to a bunch of him and Lowry talking, so I kind of get his points, and we're basically on the same team. He's just much more popular than me.
Yeah, he falls into the sort of like same circle as like I think James Lindsay, though, even though he might not be as conservative, just at like a like a foundational level or anything like that. Like he's like a classic like kind of like Obama.
Oh yeah, James is like that too. It's just in this present battle, he's aligned with the conservatives because he's seeing what woke ideology and ergo what Marxism is doing in the guise of neoliberalism or via the apparatus of neoliberalism. Marxism is coming down the pipes in a pretty strong way.
For sure. It's getting popular. I mean, I tend to be more sympathetic to that sort of stuff, though. For sure.
Yeah, you talked a lot. You dropped a lot of class bombs.
Yeah. So, yeah. I think a lot of people my age are driven by that. So, but yeah. It was really great talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.